Now I want you to watch me as I show you how good readers examine the various elements of setting in order to identify the mood within a work of fiction. Please follow along on the screen as I read the text aloud and then as I analyze those elements of setting in order to find the mood. The very first thing that readers should do when they are given a task to analyze a piece of fiction or nonfiction is really to read it first to get the general gist. You want to know what this text is about, you want to be familiar with it, and first readings kind of get you the gist of that text. The second reading and the third reading are really where you start to go into it and analyze and mark it up and annotate and do those sorts of things. So I'm going to read this first just to get the general idea, and then I'll go back again and I'll look for those elements of setting and their impact on mood. I ran as fast as I could. I hurried by the dark stone fence that surrounded the white graveyard to the split rail that seemed to mark the land between the living and the dead. I stopped briefly outside the gate to catch my breath. When I looked down, I saw a bunch of violets. They were chilly from the night and wet with dew. As I pulled them out the grass, they slumped over in my fingers and began to droop. Somewhere off in the distance, a lone bird chirped. The morning mist twisted and turned in the graveyard, dancing between the graves and trees. In the distance, the morning mist had not yet lifted from the fields. There were no ghosts yet, just ash trees and maples in a mournful row. Mamma was buried alone in the far back, against a solitary maple tree that seemed to shadow her grave. Her feet were to the east and her head was to the west. Some day I would pay the stone carver for a proper marker with her name on it, Dinah, wife of Cuff, mother of Isabel and Ruth. For now there was an old wooden cross on the ground to mark the spot where she lay, and a jagged gray rock the size of a dinner plate lying flat on the ground in front of it. We buried her the year before when the roses bloomed. Now the first winds of winter started to dance amongst the leaves on the trees and nip at your feet. So I'm going to go through the text and I'm going to notice those elements of setting. And as I'm noticing them, I also want to be imagining what it may feel like to be in this story and how that setting may be also impacting my characters. And I want to develop theories and ideas around mood and impact on setting as I'm reading, and I want to be looking for future evidence of that as I'm continuing to read on. So watch me as I analyze this first part of Chains for elements of setting and mood. So the first thing I notice is that she talks about running as fast as she can. So for me, that is usually somebody who's very anxious or they're in a hurry or they're looking to go somewhere very quickly. But I also caught a little bit of a feeling that, perhaps she's running as fast as she can because maybe she's running away from something. And then when I go down to this next line, it says I hurried. So my theory, I'm leaning more towards the fact that she wants to be where she is and that really she's in a hurry to get there. So the next thing I noticed is that there was a real contrast between this dark stone fence and this white graveyard. So there's this idea of opposites, dark and light, and contrast. And as I read on, they talked about the split rail fence or the split rail that seemed to mark the land between the living and the dead. So again, that idea of darkness with the dead and light or bright with the living, right? So there's this idea of contrast that I'm getting here. And I also know, and I have to pick up on the fact we are in a graveyard and she is talking about living and dead. So that alone is starting to make this feeling that perhaps this is a scary place or perhaps this is a place that one would not want to be found. I stopped briefly outside the gate to catch my breath. And when I read this portion, I was thinking to myself, why is she stopping to catch her breath? Is it because she ran so quickly and hurried? Or is it perhaps because she's maybe a little bit scared? And I'm going to continue to read on and look for support for that theory. So they talked a little bit here about a bunch of violets. So that to me is a sign of life and bright and happiness and vibrancy. Okay, but then the author goes on to talk about how those elements were chilly and wet with the dew. those elements of setting to me are not happy. Those are not bright. Those are not necessarily good things. Those are cold and those are chilly, and those kind of go along with the idea of a dark and gloomy graveyard full of the dead, right? And it goes on to talk about the grass. Okay, so again, something that's living, okay, just like the violets. But this grass, okay, so I pulled them out of the grass, but the violets themselves slumped over in my fingers and began to droop. So this author really wants me to see this place as a place of maybe darkness and things maybe not living, and it's a cold place, and maybe not the nicest place. Off in the distance, a lone bird. So we have just one singular bird. So the idea that she's maybe alone in this scary graveyard, and that even maybe the birds don't want to be there. The morning mist twisted and turned in the graveyard. So again, a repeat of the idea that you're in a graveyard, in case you didn't miss it, in case you didn't pick it up that first time. But this is a great example of an author giving me some figurative language, giving me some personification and a little bit of alliteration. Okay, so they're personifying the morning mist, but that idea, that alliteration, twisted and turned, those T sounds, right? But I would be a fool if I didn't also think to myself, morning mist could also be fog. And I've seen way too many Halloween clips where you have a graveyard that's full of fog and hard to see in, right? So the morning mist is if it's alive, it's twisting and turning in the graveyard and dancing between the graves and the trees. And as I'm reading this, I'm not feeling 100% comfortable here, but I'm getting the sense that the morning mist does. The morning mist is really kind of feeling like it belongs there, as if it's an element living within this area. In the distance, the morning mist had not yet lifted from the fields. There were no ghosts yet. And I really caught that word yet, and I thought, this person is not scared. Perhaps she's hurrying and running as fast as she can and out of breath because she wants to see these ghosts. Now, I myself am feeling that this is a little bit creepy or haunting, and that the mood may be a little bit dark, but to this character, it's not that bad. The trees, the ash trees and the maples are in a mournful row. So there is another word there, mournful. I know mourning is something that people do for the dead. So this first paragraph has given me a lot of references to death, and it's given me a lot of references to darkness and things dying. So I'm going to continue to read on and see if that mood is enhanced by the elements of setting in this next paragraph. So Mama was buried alone. So again, there's that idea of being alone or singular. Okay, solitary. So again, this author wants me to know that, you know, one person only. So I'm getting a feeling of a mood that's kind of lonely and isolating and sad. Okay, shadowing her grave. Okay, so even in her grave, there's darkness and shadow. Okay, but then I noticed there's this very, very specific piece here where my character is talking about her hopes and what she wants to do. And I see that as an area of bright and light. Okay, so I'm going to just draw a little sunshine here. I know my stylus may not be the best, but you get the idea. So there's a little bit of contrast in the mood here. So it's still pretty dark, but there, when this character is talking about her mother, there is definitely some bright light and beautiful pieces happening here. For now, there was an old wooden cross that lay on the ground. So the idea that all she could afford was this cross, that it may not be the nicest thing, and that she marks the place of her mother's burial with a jagged gray stone. So again, some more images around jagged kind of being not perfect and gray being dark, okay? And then this last section, I can't help but notice the details of setting there. We buried her the year before where the roses bloomed. So this is a great example of an author showing me something in a text and not telling me. Now the first winds of winter started to dance amongst the leaves on the trees and nip at your feet. So Another bit of personification, the wind is nipping and dancing, and there's a little bit more imagery around it being a cold and desolate or lonely place. So after reading this, I think about the impact it's had on me, and it makes me feel this sense of foreboding or haunting, or I'm a little bit scared. But I'm also anxious to see why is my character there, because although it's a little bit haunting for me, I definitely get the fact and the feeling that my character does want to be there. So now I've picked up all those elements of setting, and they've helped me to understand the mood of the story. And as I'm developing the mood of the story, that has also given me a great deal of information about my characters and the plot that may be happening in my story, and it's given me the ability to perhaps make some predictions about my future, about the future of my reading. So we're going to continue on, and we're going to read just a little bit further, and I want you to do the same type of thinking that you just saw me to do with this piece. Let's try that now.